Welcome back to Science Exposed, the show where we break down the latest scientific discoveries and see how they apply to your life. I'm your host, and with me, as always, is our expert. And of course, Science Exposed is brought to you by the amazing Dr. Cameron Jones, who picks all these fascinating topics for us. And today we're taking a deep dive into something that we've been getting a lot of questions about from you guys, especially those of you with families, and that's the hidden dangers of mold.
Yeah, we usually think of mold as just kind of gross. Like it makes our homes look and smell a bit yucky.
Yeah.
But what about those effects we can't actually see? Like what is mold doing to our mental health, not just our physical health?
That is what we're here to figure out. I mean, the World Health Organization, the WHO, they actually say that mold is a big health risk. And get this, some countries are saying that 10 to 50% of homes have at least some mold growing in them.
Wow.
There's a lot of us potentially living with this threat.
Yeah.
And then you add in climate change and all the crazy weather. We're having like floods, and well, the problem's probably just going to get worse.
Yeah, for sure. So to really get into this, we found this awesome research review from the University of Melbourne. It's brand new, came out just this August, and it really focuses on that link between mold exposure and mental health, which honestly hasn't gotten as much attention as the physical health impacts.
Yeah, it's almost like the science world is playing catch up.
Yeah.
This review looked at 19 studies from all over the world, different types of studies too. We were talking about, observational studies of just regular families doing their thing, but also research done after huge floods like Hurricane Harvey.
And what's really cool is most of these studies are pretty new, mostly from the last 20 years. So scientists are only just starting to figure out how mold might be messing with our minds, not just our bodies.
Okay, so let's get into some of what they found, starting with adults. This review, they found that being exposed to mold at home is linked to higher rates of depression, anxiety, stress, the whole shebang.
Which, might not sound that surprising. I mean, who wants to live in a damp, moldy house? It's just not exactly a recipe for happiness. But what's really interesting is researchers are starting to look into how mold might actually be affecting our brains on a chemical level.
Wait, are you saying mold could actually be messing with our brain chemistry?
Yeah, well, there's some evidence that points to that being a possibility. Some studies have found that mold exposure can impact how our brains work, even potentially affecting the prefrontal cortex.
And remind me, what's the prefrontal cortex do again?
Oh, it's like the control center for our emotions.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So it's not just like the stress of dealing with a moldy house, but maybe the mold itself is affecting how our brains work. That's kind of creepy.
It is. And it's important to remember, these are mostly observational studies. They can show us that things are connected, but they can't prove for sure that one causes the other. We definitely need more research to figure out exactly what's going on.
Right. Makes sense. But the fact that we're seeing this pattern in lots of different studies using different methods, well, it's definitely something to pay attention to.
Yeah.
And remember how we talked about climate change and those extreme weather events? Well, the review also looked at studies done after floods, and I bet you can guess what they found.
Yeah, probably not good news.
Not exactly.
Yeah.
Those studies showed a connection between mold exposure after things like Hurricane Harvey and a higher risk of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and way higher stress levels in general. Like imagine going through a flood, your house is a mess, and then on top of that, you have to deal with mold. It's a recipe for some serious mental health struggles.
Absolutely.
And it's not just a few people we're talking about here.
Yeah.
One study found that a crazy 82% of homes had mold just 45 days after Hurricane Harvey.
Wow. 82%. That's wild.
Yeah,
Makes you think.
it does. And that brings us to another group that's really vulnerable to the effects of mold parents, especially new moms.
Yeah, this is where it gets personal for a lot of our listeners.
Totally. So is it the mold itself that's causing these mental health problems for parents? Or is it the added stress of having to deal with mold on top of, everything else that comes with being a parent?
That's the million-dollar question, right? I mean, it's probably a combo of things. Just imagine you've got a newborn, you're sleep deprived, maybe a little hormonal, and then bam, you find mold growing in the baby's nursery. That's a lot to deal with.
For sure. And here's where it gets even more interesting. One study suggested that the relationship between mold and mental health might actually go both ways.
Meaning it could work in both directions.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. How so?
Well, they're saying that if you're already struggling with mental health issues like depression or anxiety, it might actually be harder to keep mold away. Think about if you're already feeling down, finding the energy to clean regularly or fix things around the house. Well, that can feel really overwhelming, and that could lead to more mold.
Oh, wow. So it's like this vicious cycle.
Exactly. But we can't forget about the littlest members of the family, the kids. They're still growing and developing. So how is mold affecting them?
Right. Well, the review included a bunch of studies that looked specifically at kids under 10 years old.
And I'm guessing the results weren't exactly sunshine and rainbows.
Not quite. These studies found a link between mold exposure and all sorts of emotional challenges in kids. Things like having trouble controlling their emotions and just generally more emotional symptoms.
Which makes sense if you think about how mold might be affecting their brains, especially when they're so young and their brains are still developing.
Exactly. Researchers are saying that mold could be affecting those developing brains in ways we're just starting to understand. It's a whole new area of research, which is exciting, but also a bit scary, to be honest.
Definitely. And speaking of things that can be a bit scary, let's talk about how scientists actually measure mold exposure in these studies. Because it turns out studying mold is kind of like trying to catch a ghost.
Oh, yeah. How so?
Well, it's tricky. Most of the studies in this review relied on people reporting themselves. Like they asked people about the mold in their homes, which, as we all know, isn't always the most reliable method.
True. What one person thinks is a little bit of mold could be someone else's worst nightmare.
Exactly. And let's be real, sometimes we just don't see it, especially if it's hiding behind walls or under things.
So self-reporting can give us some clues, but it's not the most accurate way to measure mold exposure.
But the good news is scientists are always coming up with better ways to measure mold and its effects. It's a work in progress, but they're getting there.
That's science always pushing the boundaries and getting a clearer picture.
Okay, so before we get too lost in the science weeds, let's bring it back to our listeners and what they're worried about. What are the big takeaways here? What do families need to know about mold and mental health?
I think the biggest takeaway is that mold isn't just a cosmetic problem or something that makes you sneeze. It can actually affect our family's mental well-being in ways we're only beginning to grasp.
Yeah, it's like this hidden danger we really need to pay attention to, especially because of what it could mean for kids and adults in the long run. And, knowledge is power. When we understand the risks that come with mold, it gives us the power to do something about it and protect ourselves and the people we love.
Absolutely. And that leads us to a really important question for everyone listening. We've talked about the science, but what about actually doing something about it? What can you actually do to prevent mold in your home and deal with it if it's already there, especially with climate change making things more difficult?
That is a great question. It's something to really think about. We'll be diving into some practical tips and strategies a little later, but for now, stick with us. We'll be right back after a quick break with more insights into this whole world of mold and mental health. And hey, if you're finding this deep dive helpful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Science Exposed so you don't miss out on future episodes.
Yeah, it really is a question we all need to be thinking about, especially as parents and caregivers. We want to create the healthiest, safest spaces for our kids and our families, right?
Totally. And I think this research really highlights how connected our environment and our mental well-being are. It's like you can't separate the two.
It's a good point. We tend to think of mold as just a physical problem, like something that makes us cough or gives us allergies. But what these studies are hinting at is that it could be affecting our minds and emotions too. It's not just about sniffles and sneezes.
Yeah, it goes deeper than just feeling a bit off. This research looked at some pretty serious mental health issues, like depression, anxiety, PTSD. We're talking about conditions that can really impact people's lives.
And it's important to note that while these studies focused on the link between mold and mental health, they didn't really get into the specifics of different types of mold. Like, is one type more problematic than another?
That's a good point, because I'm sure not all mold is the same.
Yeah.
Some types might be more likely to produce those mycotoxins we talked about before, the ones that could be messing with our brains.
Exactly. That's definitely something we need more research on. Like, which types of mold pose the biggest risk to our mental health? Then we can target our prevention and cleanup efforts better.
And figure out the best way to deal with those specific types. Because let's be real, most of us wouldn't even know where to start if we found black mold in our homes. Like, do you bleach it? Scrub it? Call the Ghostbusters? It's a mystery for a lot of people.
Right. And that confusion and not knowing what to do can lead to more stress and anxiety, which, as we've learned, can actually make the mold problem worse. It's like a vicious cycle.
Totally. So how do we break that cycle? What are some practical things our listeners can do right now to figure out if they have mold and deal with it if they do? We don't want to leave anyone feeling overwhelmed.
Of course not. Well, first things first, you got to know what to look for. So keep an eye out for any weird colors on your walls or ceilings, especially in damp places like bathrooms and basements.
And that musty smell. Don't ignore your nose. If something smells off, it's worth checking out.
Absolutely. And remember, mold can be sneaky. It can hide behind walls or under carpets. So if you smell something funky but can't see any mold, it might be a good idea to call in a pro to take a look. They have tools and know-how to find hidden mold.
Okay, so let's say we've found some mold. What do we do next?
Well, it depends on how much mold there is and what kind it is. For small patches of mold, you might be able to clean it yourself with a bleach and water solution. But super important, always wear gloves and a mask when cleaning mold. You don't want to be breathing in those spores.
Safety first. Always a good reminder. And what if it's a bigger mold problem or we're not sure what to do?
In that case, it's best to call in a professional mold removal company. They have the experience and equipment to handle it safely and properly.
Got it. So they can assess the situation, figure out what kind of mold it is, and tell us what to do.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about identifying and getting rid of mold. But what about stopping it from growing in the first place? How can we prevent mold from ever becoming a problem?
Great question. One of the most important things is keeping things dry.
Hmm.
Make sure your bathroom and kitchen have good ventilation. Use those exhaust fans when showering or cooking.
And basements?
Oh yeah, if you have a basement, make sure it's waterproofed so moisture can't seep in from the ground. And don't forget about the little things that can make things damp, like leaving wet towels on the floor or overwatering your plants. It's all about being aware of our habits.
So basically, making it a less inviting place for mold to grow, like we're taking away its welcome mat.
Exactly. And even if you don't see mold doesn't mean it's not there. Mold spores are tiny and they can be floating in the air we breathe. So it's always good to improve your indoor air quality in general.
Like using air purifiers.
Exactly. Or even just opening windows to let fresh air in. Those are good things to do no matter what.
For sure. And good old-fashioned cleaning can't hurt either.
Right. Absolutely. Vacuuming carpets, dusting surfaces, washing bedding, all that helps remove dust and mold spores.
Okay, so we've covered a lot. We talked about the possible link between mold and mental health, how to spot it and get rid of it, and how to prevent it from growing in the first place.
And we touched on the need for more research, especially into the different types of mold and how they specifically affect our brains. It's a really interesting area with a lot more to learn.
The more we know about mold and how it can affect us, the better we can protect ourselves and our families.
Absolutely. It's all about having the knowledge to make smart choices about our health.
Okay, before we move on to our final thought, I want to remind everyone that while mold is a serious issue, we don't want to freak anyone out.
Right. We need to be realistic about it. Mold is a common problem, and most people who come into contact with it don't have serious mental health issues.
But for people who are already struggling with mental health or who are more sensitive to it, mold can definitely make things worse.
And even if mold isn't directly causing mental health problems, the stress and worry of having a mold issue can make existing conditions harder to manage.
So we need to be aware of the risks and do our best to create a healthy, mold-free environment for ourselves and our families as much as possible.
Exactly. And if you're worried about mold in your home or what it could be doing to your health, don't hesitate to talk to your doctor or a professional mold removal expert.
They can help you figure out what's going on and come up with a plan to deal with it.
And they can give you tips on how to prevent mold from growing in the future, which is always the best approach.
Okay, so are you ready for that final thought-provoking question to leave our listeners pondering?
Hit me with it. I'm all ears. We've talked about the science and the practical stuff about dealing with mold. But here's something else to think about. How can we, as individuals and as communities, push for healthier housing policies and regulations that really focus on mold prevention and getting rid of it? It's not just about our own homes,
Yeah.
It's about making bigger changes that help everyone.
That's such a good point. We need to make sure that all families have access to safe, affordable housing that doesn't have mold or other environmental dangers. It's about making sure everyone has a basic standard of living that supports well-being.
Exactly. Everyone deserves to live in a healthy place that's good for both their physical and mental health. And that's something we can all work towards.
For sure. It's about spreading awareness, pushing for stricter building codes, and supporting policies that prioritize dealing with mold in both new and old houses.
Right. We need to hold landlords responsible for providing mold-free places to live and make sure tenants have the help and resources they need if they do have mold problems in their homes. It's about working together to create a healthier future for all of us.
It's definitely a team effort. But before we wrap things up, I have one last thought-provoking question that's been bugging me. We've focused a lot on the bad stuff about mold, which is important to know. But I'm wondering, could there be any good things about being exposed to mold?
Whoa, okay, that's an interesting twist. I'm listening.
Well, think about it. Our bodies are always interacting with the environment, right? Including all those tiny bacteria and fungi.
Mm-hmm.
And some exposure to those microbes is actually good for our immune system.
Right, like the hygiene hypothesis.
Exactly.
It basically says that our super clean modern environments might be why more people have allergies and autoimmune problems. By not being exposed to enough microbes, we're actually hurting our immune systems.
So could it be that being exposed to a little bit of mold, especially when we're young, could help train our immune systems and make us stronger in the long run? Like it's a workout for our immune systems, helping them learn to fight off bad stuff.
That's a fascinating question. And I don't know of any research that specifically looks at that with mold, but it's a really interesting idea, and it shows how complex our relationship is with the world of microbes.
Right. It's kind of like what doesn't kill you makes you stronger.
Hmm.
Maybe a little mold exposure isn't so bad after all. Maybe it helps us build up our immunity.
Okay, I need to see a lot more evidence before I start telling people to go hug some mold. But I love that you're thinking outside the box and challenging what we think we know. That's what science is all about.
Absolutely. It wouldn't be science exposed if we didn't leave you with some unanswered questions to think about.
That's what we do best, making you curious and encouraging you to look at the world with a scientific mind.
Exactly. So as you go about your day, take a minute to think about how amazing it is that our bodies are constantly interacting with the environment, even the parts that might seem a little gross. And remember, knowledge is power. The more we know about the world around us, the better we can take care of ourselves and make good decisions about our health.
Couldn't have said it better myself. So let's keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep exploring together.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of mold and mental health. We'll be back next week with another fascinating topic, so make sure to subscribe, share with your friends, and as always, stay curious.